Time to rate all British motorcycle companies from best to worst. There's a lot, so for the sake of my sanity, I'm breaking it down into eras, starting with 1881 to 1918. For the purposes of this list, I'm not including companies that only made three-wheeled cars, four cars, cycle cars, mini cars, and snowmobiles, and the dates shown are when they made motorcycles. Here's the criteria I used for grading this list, but for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to point out the highlights. Okay, let's get started. Edward Pennington was a con man who made the worst bikes on this list, and that's saying something considering this list has crude oil steam bikes. The bikes had no cooling fins, they almost never started, and if they did, they would plod along at 8 to 20 miles per hour before seizing up. The entire thing was a way to scam investors. Speaking of which, Harry J. Lawson was another con man. His very involvement with motorcycles was cited as a reason not to invest in it. Then Pennington scammed him into buying the bike design for £100,000. The bike barely functioned, no one wanted it, an epic failure. Made a primitive 2-cylinder motor bicycle without cooling fins, or a muffler, and holding about 1 cup of gas. It was considered out of date in the 1890s. They made an 800cc bike without cooling fins, and the connecting rod going right to the rear wheel. When it wasn't seizing up, it was going slow, which the company claimed was good because it meant less wear. They tried fixing things by making a water-cooled version, but it cost twice as much as a normal bike, and that's that. Made a terrible bike, even for the times. The spark plug would stick into the rider's thigh, who, quote, received innumerable shocks therefrom. The contact breaker was flimsy and needed readjustment 2 to 3 times a day. The rear brake was a bicycle brake that would, quote, stink abominably and shortly afterwards burst into flames. The company went under after a few years and the assets were bought by Veloce. Made a 500cc motorcycle with a shaft drive that was, quote, unlikely to survive a trip to the corner store. No one bought this bike, and then another company trademarked the name Aeolus, and that was the final nail in the coffin. They made motorcycles and trikes that ran off steam and crude oil. It's as terrible as it sounds. Sprick is Crips spelled backwards. They made a crappy bike by clipping a Minerva engine onto the handlebars of a bicycle so you could breathe the exhaust fumes. Cash grab attempt that fell flat on its face. They made the Million Mobile, a cheap bike with an engine high up so you could choke on exhaust fumes. And then they had the gall to charge 40 guineas when a better bike cost 30. Their one vehicle was a trike that could possibly go 15 miles per hour. It had a 2-stroke water-cooled engine put upside down above the rear axle, which it drove via bevel gears. The water was put inside the frame and would move by convection. The frame got scalding hot. Made an ugly motor bicycle with bought-in parts with the engine put on the rear wheel, and tried to claim this was the ideal design for motorcycles, but nobody believed him. Yet another guy to get scammed by Pennington. William Baines had a joint company with him that went bankrupt. Not wanting to give up, he formed another company with banker William Norris, and they made Didion Bouton trike ripoffs years after that was out of fashion. Made a bike with a really long frame in order to allow a person to take the cylinder off the crankcase easier. They thought this would be a highly desirable feature, but it wasn't. The Slinger was an attempt to redesign the wheel, so to speak. Made in the town of Settle, not to be confused with Seattle. It was basically a little motorcycle with a water-cooled Didion engine with another motorcycle frame attached, kind of like a trailer cycle. When going forward, it was okay, but when trying to back up, it was like a truck backing up with a trailer. Made a steam-powered tricycle that could go 9 miles per hour. The company kept getting speeding tickets testing their trikes since it was illegal to go over 4 miles per hour. And when they went 150 miles without a man walking in front of them with the flag, which was the law at the time, the government forced them to shut down. They made steam-powered motorcycles that were utilitarian looking. It burned methylated spirit and took 4 minutes to build up pressure. Then you had to walk the bike 3 yards before it started. Primitive motor bicycle with a clip-on engine. At least they didn't hang from the down tube. Something the company was aware of and liked pointing out, but that's like congratulating themselves for drinking beer to hydrate instead of whiskey. The company also claimed the engine came free of charge, which is laughable, as their logic being you are buying the bicycle frame for the cost of a motorcycle and you just happen to get the engine and components for free. A company that kept stealing other people's designs and failing. They started with a front-wheel drive trike called the Wienermobile, a copy of the German Vanneman. After that failure, they made the Cyclonet, a copy of the German Cyclonet, which also flopped. Company that was dead on arrival. They sold conventional lightweight singles for the low price of 27 pounds, except it really wasn't cheap. Things like gearboxes and rear brakes were sold at a premium, ultimately making it more expensive than other bikes, and no one was fooled. They claimed to have a factory in Coventry, which never existed. They actually sold rebadged Rexes, which themselves were just bicycles with engines clipped on them. Then they had the gall to claim, we are not just a firm who clips on an engine to a bicycle and claims it is a motorcycle. They must not have understood that humans have eyes and can clearly see it's a clip-on engine. Copied everyone else's designs, used the same bought-in parts as everyone else, and even copied another company's name. No originality, and died quickly. Took a conventional motorcycle and connected it to another empty bike frame and put a sidecar between them, and no one liked it. They would cut a bicycle seating tube out and shove an engine in its place. Boastfully named their brand Leader, entered a race to prove it, and got second place, and then went out of business. Built race bikes. In 1912, they entered the Isle of Man races and took a picture of their bike. The superstitious locals believed this was the devil's work and tore down the building where the picture was taken. They lost that race, by the way. Then they lost their star racer after he refused to use their bikes. Then World War I hit, and then they died. Rebadged Rex bikes with the premium primo name until World War I. Then an injunction was taken against them by Premier Cycle Co., so they changed their name to PMC and then went out of business. Failed for being needlessly expensive without being a luxury brand. Their midweight singles cost around 75 pounds when other companies sold similar bikes for 30 pounds. Scuzzy liars who claimed to have a gigantic factory with the most advanced technology known to man, and that they were working with the War Department, and that their bikes would never slip on wet ground. It was all BS. They were just a bicycle dealer making bikes with bought-in parts. Not General Motors Company, but General Motor Car Company. Yeah, it's confusing. Made a bike that was known for being able to go, quote, 12 miles per hour easily. It was also considered high-tech looking for the time. Actually made their own engine and mounted it vertically and used a heavy-duty frame. The only problem was they offered to let prospective buyers test ride the bike for 50 miles. This is bad in retrospect, as multiple test rides basically turned them into used bikes before they were even sold. Stands for guy and wheeler. They made a 62 centimeter bicycle frame and shoved a Minerva engine in the back of it. The seat was on top of the rear wheel, but they didn't make the handlebars longer or move the pedals back, so you had to sit like this. Put an FN engine in a bicycle. Specifically advertising it as a pedal assist, basically an autocycle, which no one wanted at that time. Yet another steam-powered bike. It was fueled by a paraffin and had a flash boiler, so you didn't have to wait around 10 minutes to start it. The design was stolen from a French engineer, with some things changed around to get around patents. By 1903, steam power was very out of fashion, so the company didn't last long. Second company called Comet lazily copied the Grand X Precision bike, only to immediately fail. Made a 1 horsepower ladies bike that no lady wanted to ride. Made a bicycle with a clip-on engine put on a bicycle frame, only this was 1908 and not 1901. Two different companies that died so fast they barely existed. Both made machines using clip-on Minerva engines on a bicycle, and they certainly won't be the last to do this. Same thing as before, but it's a modified bicycle frame made into a trike. Designed by Miss Olive Kent, these scooters looked like they were designed by committee. Part motorcycle, part tri-car, part cargo trike, part scooter. Total flop. All three made Didion knockoffs using Didion engines and tried to compete with actual Didions. Another company that made a Didion copy using Didion engines. But this one was promising in that you only needed an oil change every 50 miles, unlike the other ones. 6 companies that did the exact same thing. Launched around World War I, made the same generic bikes with the same 269 Villiers 2-stroke engine, and then flopped almost immediately. Not as cool as modern M&Ms. Same things before. Same generic Villiers 269cc bike. Same death by World War I. Slightly less bad because they didn't know World War I was coming. Another company that started in World War I using a 269cc Villiers engine on a third-party frame with third-party components. They tried coming back in 1919 and failed. Stands for Hill Brothers. They made a 1.5 horsepower machine that immediately flopped. Made a machine that put the engine and components on the front forks. It flopped faster than warp speed. Rebadged an Austro-Hungarian bike. Couldn't even last a year. Next. Made one bike with a 3.5 horsepower JAP engine. Then died and existed as a zombie company on paper, haunting manufacturing lists for years. Tried to enter the market in 1904 with a conventional bike using bought-in parts and immediately failed. Then tried again in 1915 under the Elmden name and immediately failed. A company created by the son of the guy who created the other Rudge. It is sort of similar to Brough and Brough Superior, except in this case the son did not make a better bike. In fact, he made a worse bike. It was just another bicycle with a clip-on Minerva engine. Another 4 companies that basically made the same type of bike. This time a bicycle with a clip-on Minerva engine. All died around the same time. Only higher on the list because they lasted a little bit longer. Same as before except better designed. Basically rebadged FN bikes assembled by Abingdon and sold by Carey. I can't forgive them for not even trying to assemble their own bikes. They tried to expand rapidly in a desperate greedy blitzscaling attempt, only for World War I to knock them flat on their face. They copied a French bike called the Bruneau, which is kind of pathetic since the Bruneau was just a bicycle with a clip-on engine that anyone could have designed. Then they copied a German bike with a better design before going under. A case of someone thinking they could get rich selling a bike made with nothing but bought-in parts. Instead, they went bankrupt. Pitcher and Bartlett made a tandem bike intended for husband and wife. The 2 3/4 horsepower Chappelle engine used a crossbelt, which motorcyclists at the time disliked, and the bike flopped very quickly. Made the first mini bike with no seat unless you paid extra. The engine was 2 horsepower, ironically more than some motorcycles of that era. It didn't sell. Another dime a dozen company that thought they could clip a Minerva engine onto a bicycle and make it big. As the name implies, they made electric trikes. The engine itself was like a large kitchen mixer used to drive the front wheel. It didn't last long. Made a unique trike similar to a modern Can-Am. Possibly didn't sell a single model. Despite claiming to be the best bikes ever made, they were in fact not the best. They were just clip-on engines and bicycle frames. Although, to give them credit, they made a custom frame stretching it out so the engine could fit behind the seat tube. At the end, they tried to make a normal motorcycle, but it was too late. The press of the time seems to think the Swallow was going to be this big deal, but instead it died. Its owner, Harry Reid, went on to make Dot. Motorcycles were an afterthought for this company. They were basically seen as a way to sell their bicycles to motorists. So they did the cheapest thing you could do, clip a Minerva engine onto their bicycle. Second attempt by H. Carter to create a motorcycle company. After Howard failed, this also failed. The company that dabbled in making bikes that flopped. Another small-time dealer who thought he could hit it rich by clipping an engine onto a bicycle frame. Since they lasted a few years, they were a little bit higher up. Yet another company that made generic bikes using 269cc Villiers engines and bought-in parts. Built cheap-as-hell motorcycles with Minerva engines that cost about 1,900 pounds in today's money. More unoriginal bikes made entirely with bought-in parts. The idea was the vehicle could be converted from a 4-car into a motorcycle and vice versa by the owner. The company didn't last long. They made alright conventional bikes for the time, but the cheapest model was 50 pounds at a time when you can get a bike for 19. Not the band Creedence Clearwater Revival. They made the Midget Twin. A V-twin made with bought-in parts didn't last long. Media of the time acted like this was the defining bike for the coming new age bikes. It didn't pan out. Made a bike with a clip-on Minerva engine in a BSA frame. Was more interested in sales than making a good bike. Not to be confused with Harley Davidson. Davison made your typical low-end early Edwardian bike with Minerva engines, and then didn't update the design for years. Yet another company that made bikes using clip-on Minerva engines on a bicycle frame. They did okay until the market became oversaturated. They made typical bikes for the era. Although better designed than most, it died very fast. Made tandem trikes with water-cooled engines. I think it's better designed than the usual 4-car where the passenger blocks your view, but I guess people at the time didn't think so. Collide started out a tiny bit better than most bike companies by simply not making a bicycle with a clip-on engine. Instead, they made conventional bikes with bought-in parts. These sold in very low numbers. Maybe 100 total in 16 years. They stayed alive purely from the sales of bicycles. Bikes made by DH&S, aka H&C Diamond, aka Dorset Ford and Me, aka DF&M, aka Diamond Engineering. If that sounds confusing, it is. This gives an idea of their lack of focus. They'd make a model, then end it. They'd enter competitions, do bad, then stop trying. They'd stop production and start production again. This cycle went on till World War I. Used an extended frame on a Minerva engine, the idea being the longer bike would make it more steady, but no one bought it. Made a bunch of primitive bikes with 5 different types of engines. At least they didn't just put a clip-on engine on a bicycle. Made a flat twin, put high up in the frame, making it top heavy. Created an auto cycle where the engine was attached to the rear or front wheel and didn't last long. Dead on a rival company, and for the usual reasons. Made a conventional bike with bought-in parts that looked the same as the others because ultimately they were. Made a conventional bike with the Bradbury engine, then died. At a time when most people used clip-on Minerva engines on bicycle frames, Clarendon actually made their own engine. The bikes didn't sell well and the founder went off to make Arno. Made a conventional bike for the era. Their gimmick was putting an engine horizontally, and this flopped and its founder, H. Carter, went back to making bicycles. As the name implies, they made bicycles to ship to colonies and America, where it was assumed the locals would use these as utilitarian workhorses. The whole idea got torpedoed by World War I, figuratively and literally due to U-boats. Made the usual primitive Edwardian motorcycles and 4-cars with bought-in parts. Not much distinguishes them, but at least they didn't, use clip-on engines. Started by attaching an engine to a bicycle frame, then moved on to more proper motorcycles before shutting down. Made a 3.5 horsepower single and a 6 horsepower and an 8 horsepower V-twin. They use bought-in parts and engines like many others and died fast. TD Cross made transmission parts, then decided to make motorcycles. They made the usual conventional design bikes with bought-in parts. Nothing stood out. Sales weren't great. Their thing was making heavy-duty utility motorcycles using JAPV twins. This was back when motorcycles could still compete with cars for the family market. Also, the name is unfortunate as Craven means cowardly. They made mid and lightweight bikes with bought-in engines and components. They also made their own frame kits to sell to other manufacturers like Elswick. Reg Sampson was a man, quote, fond of publicity. He wanted a name on his bike as an ego trip. The bikes were conventional with bought-in parts and engines. Nothing new. Company died after a few years. Roulette made frames first, and motorcycles were kind of an afterthought. They were hoping to sell their frames, but when that didn't pan out, they made bikes with the usual 269cc Villiers engine and bought-in parts. Until World War I halted production, they never tried again. Made lightweight motorcycles fitted with various engines. Didn't do great. Another Regina, another bike with bought-in parts and engines. This one was designed kind of oddly in that the engine jutted downward below the frame. Quote, a species of motor's tricycle. The Dickinson Moret was an interesting design. It kind of looks like a primitive version of today's touring trikes, but it was very weak. First attempt to make one of those hybrid scooter motorcycles that pop up from time to time, but by trying to appeal to both motorcycle and scooter markets, it appealed to neither. They started with a clip-on Minerva engine, but at least they had a heavy-duty frame to go with it. From there, they went on to make trikes and quadricycles, but high costs meant they didn't sell well. Bradbury got the license to make Birch engines, so they took their existing bikes and stuck the new engine engine in them and called the brand Peerless, one of the many firms that used bought-in Minerva engines and attached them to a bicycle. But they quickly switched to making more conventional design bikes, although still using bought-in parts. They eventually moved on to making cars. Another steam engine bike. It was 3 horsepower and can go 45 miles per hour. Pearson and Cox did the best out of the steam bike companies, and that's not saying much. Their trike was basically a motorcycle with a wicker chair behind it. They came in various engine sizes between 2 3/4 to 5 horsepower, depending on how much one wanted to spend. They were advertised as cars. Yet another company that makes run-of-the-mill bikes with bought-in parts, but actually lasted a while. The club for companies that started out around World War I, then made generic bikes from bought-in parts, and then died in World War I. The club for companies that started right before World War I, made generic bikes from bought-in parts, and then died in World War I. Made a V-twin and a low-priced ladies bike. Mid-decade slump killed them. Rest in peace. Made a bike with a 90-degree V-twin, which they claim could run on one cylinder at a time to let the other cool down. They also claimed it was the fastest bike on the road. These are dubious claims. They made the usual bike for the era. Lightweight, using bought-in parts. World War I killed them. Repurposed the Binks inline 4 bike with a new badge. Also offered a tri-car version. Failed for the same reason as Binks, high prices. Part of the first motorcycle boom. Actually made decent design bikes, but didn't last long. Company that made bikes with bought-in parts. This time in a racer design. Made an odd-looking bicycle frame with a bought-in clip-on engine. The company that kept desperately switching designs and types and makes of engines in short periods of time. They did this until they threw in the towel after 7 years. Maud's Motor Mart was a bicycle dealer in Great Portland Street. They decided to sell their own brand, a conventional machine with bought-in parts and a 4 horsepower JAP or Peugeot engine. At 40 pounds, it was expensive, so they went back to selling other brands of bikes. Made conventional Edwardian bikes with bought-in parts out of a couple of workshop garages. Couldn't compete against the larger companies. Made tri-cars that were sold as a novelty to the rich. Their slow production time killed them. Very rare bike that wasn't advertised or sold by dealers. It used a 350cc V-twin JAP, itself a rare engine. The bike was mostly used in competitions. A motorcycle dealer, William Morris, decided to make his own bikes. His design was somewhat unique in that he essentially cut the gas tank in half and put the engine in front of it. It didn't sell well. Portmanteau of Mills and Fulford. They were a sidecar company that made average bikes with bought-in parts. Made singles, V-twins, tri-cars, and kit bikes. Unfortunately, they started in a slump in motorcycle sales and never picked up steam. Made a bike for the Brooklands racetrack. It was a JAP V-twin, and that's it. Made a conventional bike that came in 4 sizes, depending on how much you wanted to spend. At least it wasn't another clip-on engine type bike. Made a conventional bike with engines ranging between 2 1/4 and 3 1/2 horsepowers. They cost 3 pounds more than other similar bikes, so they didn't make it. Built engines and bikes for a couple years. That's about it. Built 30 bikes with their own engines. Only one still exists. Made a small touring bike using a 293cc JAP engine. The idea was the bike would be mail ordered to cut costs with interest-free payments, but New Imperial undercut them and Graves died. Was basically an attempt to revive the Quadrant brand, even though Quadrant wasn't dead. They used bought-in parts and died fast. Mohawk produced primitive 2 1/4 horsepower and 3 horsepower machines. For the period, the bike was designed better than most, as in special heavy-duty frame and upright engine. Still wasn't enough to save them in the mid-decade slump. A company whose gimmick was having a frame that could use any engine. After a couple of years, they switched to making mechanical cables, which are known as Bowden cables. Neofold made tricycles. Their gimmick was that the front wheel could fold in, kind of like this. They used 2 1/2 horsepower bought-in engines. They tried to be original, but it wasn't enough. Iris made water-cooled bikes with various sized engines of their own design. They didn't have radiators. Instead, the wind was supposed to cool the tank holding the water. This didn't work on hot days, and the company switched to making cars. Did the usual clip-on engine thing, but they actually made their own engine. They then gave up and switched to making bicycles. Robinson and Price made very primitive but well-made bikes with a decent design, something they were quick to point out. They still went under anyways. Made some wonky bikes with bought-in V-twins. They had hand crank starters like a car. This model has a double muffler and fan on the engine. These were advanced for their time, therefore expensive, but they didn't have the looks to attract the luxury market. Star mostly made engines to sell to other companies, but they also tried to make motorcycles. They didn't sell, so they switched to making cars. They started by making a motor wheel, then moved on to conventional bikes, trikes, and tandems, as well as trivoturettes, and a governess car for cycling with the family. These contraptions lasted until World War I. After that, they focused on making cars. Made motorcycles that were, quote, very primitive, and that's saying something considering it was Edwardian times. Still, somehow survived a decade. Never tried to be anything more than average. Started with clip-on Minerva engines on a bicycle frame, moved on to conventional bikes made with bought-in parts, named after the famous Battle of Trafalgar. If you don't know what that is, seriously man, you don't know what that is? It was nothing special but cost 44 guineas when others cost 19. Started with the usual clip-on engine on a bicycle frame that cheaper Edwardian bike makers did, but later moved on to making more conventional motorcycles until 1909. Clipped an engine onto a bicycle frame, except unlike so many others, they actually made the engines themselves. Too bad they didn't design a better frame. Made a bike with a 6 horsepower horsepower V-twin precision engine and a JAP single. Neither sold well, and Rolf moved on to making bicycle parts. Made Didion engines under license and made a Maxim machine gun version too. It would have looked similar to this. They lasted until 1910 making Didion engines under license and sharing their building with Swift, the company that wanted to be Ariel. They started with a primitive bike and a trike that copied Ariel's design. Then they rebadged actual Ariels, only changing things up slightly. Then they expanded their lineup with Ariel lookalikes. World War I ended their dreams of being Ariel 2.0. Made 350cc bikes with rubber buffers for shocks, which was rare at the time. Got taken over by Humber, who rebadged their own bikes as Centaurs until the brand recognition faded and they dropped the name. Made for the military for dispatch riders. They came in 210 or 270 cc's. Contract ran out during the war. They actually made their own engine, a 269cc single, which was admirable, but World War I happened and their sales cratered. Made a bike with their own engine and better styling than most early Edwardian bikes, but tied anyways. Built the gyro car, and as the name implies, it used gyroscopes to balance on two wheels. The vehicle was designed by Count Pyotr Shilovsky, but when World War I started, Shilovsky left for Russia and never returned to Britain. Made a heavy-duty bike with a 292cc JAP engine. It was meant to handle the inhospitable terrain of New Zealand. There seems to be a fascination with them in New Zealand as there's an attempt to build replicas. The name Deluxe was a blatant overcompensation. They were just another company making bikes from bought-in parts. Single gear? Oh, and AEB's the founder's initials, A.E. Bradford. He was a school teacher who rode bikes in his spare time. One day he decided he wanted to make real money, not teacher money. Teachers started £18,000 a year. AEB knew he couldn't compete with the other bike companies, so he sold kit bikes, which are bikes you assemble yourself, meaning he could sell them for £19 or $2,000 in today's money. Made the world's first inline four. And as cool as that is, the problem was the bike cost too much. So the founders switched to making carburetors. Made the first e-bike. It was powered by 10 lead-acid batteries. It was 1/2 horsepower and can go 9 miles per hour. Speed was controlled by disconnecting batteries. It even had electric lights. Built a V-twin, an inline 3, and a shaft-driven inline 4. Pretty advanced stuff for the time, but also expensive and lacking the styling needed to appeal to the well-off. They shut down in 1908. They made bikes with various enclosed bought-in engines. These bikes didn't sell well, which is bad since they weren't particularly expensive at 30 guineas. The Osborne was kind of a deluxe bike for the time in that it had things like a 4-speed gearbox, special forks, and a backsliding wheel so you could keep the leather belt tight. It was powered by a 3.5 horsepower Peugeot engine, but all this meant it was expensive. An engine company that made their own motorcycle and 4 cars. They seemed to sell okay for a time, but by the 19-teens, it was over, so they decided to focus on making replacement valves. Financed by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, they made the most steampunk-looking bike on this list. Created by A.W. Wall, the guy who made the auto wheel. Once World War I started, he focused on the auto wheel. This bicycle company, they tried to make their own bike, and these sold poorly, so they tried selling at a discount, and when that didn't work, they quit. Manufactured a clip-on water-cooled engine and put them on a bicycle frame. Also made a tri-car. When selling others their engine proved more lucrative than selling motorcycles, they switched to that. Famous engine company that made their own bikes for a few years. Built their own V-twins between 340 and 480 cc's. They also won some competitions, but went under during World War I. Despite being called Win, they really didn't do more than survive until they eventually lost. Win made bikes between 500 and 600 cc's with precision brand engines. The only notable thing they did was have a collapsible sidecar, company that made engines for other motorcycle companies. They tried to make their own bikes, but this made their engine customers mad, so they sneaked out small batches trying to ease their way into the market. It didn't work. A machine company that experimented with making motorcycles of various sizes. Sales were okay, but by World War I they wanted out, and it was the perfect excuse. Offered slightly above average bikes for the period in that they had 3-speed gearboxes and high quality components. Couldn't survive the shortages in World War I. Air Springs Limited made a bike with air suspension shocks, basically as a viral marketing stunt to sell to motorcyclists and bicyclists. They didn't sell well, and ASL trudged along for a while. The final straw was not getting a government contract in World War I, so they stopped making bikes forever. Self-propelled wheel you clamp onto a bicycle, it's kind of awesome in its ridiculousness. Say what you will, but this thing sold right up to World War I and beyond. Stands for Perry-Val. At first they tried to niche down and concentrate on big V-twins, but gave that up and made lightweight singles with generic 269cc Villiers engines, and they just did that until World War I. As typical for the time, they mostly made lightweight bikes with bought-in parts. They tried to win races, but didn't do great. This hurt sales and production slowed. FB stood for Fowler and Bingham. and Wizard was one of their makes. They made the usual bike with the 269cc Villiers engine, except these sold somewhat well. Only problem was FB couldn't scale, they couldn't produce fast enough, then World War I happened. Stands for J.E. Smith. They started with a 1 horsepower, 116cc 4-stroke, and then sold that one model of bike until World War I. Released a 225cc 2-stroke with a torpedo-style tank. It was 28 pounds and sold well, and they quickly expanded it into other midweight models until World War I. A bicycle company that made specialized frames to carry engines. They made average singles and V-twin bikes between 270 and 500 cc's. A packaging company that built a 500cc single with their own engine, which is kind of impressive, but sold in small numbers, possibly less than 200. The club of companies that started in World War I made conventional bikes with bought-in parts and survived World War I. Club of companies that started right before World War I made conventional bikes with bought-in parts and survived World War I. Parent company of British Excelsior made bikes with their own badge, didn't sell well. Dunkley made baffling choices. The company started with a natural gas-powered car that came with a tube so you could steal street lamp gas. Then they made a 350cc single, but no one bought that, so they survived off selling steam circuses and steam organs. Then in World War I, they cooked up the idea of a motorcycle baby carriage. Lloyd Motor Engineering started out by making a bike with no cooling fins. They claimed overheating was not a problem, but got rid of the engine in less than a year, so make of that what you will. After that, they made a bunch of conventional singles and V-twins until World War I. The idea was basically, what if you controlled the motorcycle from the sidecar? The vehicle came with a 770 V-twin JAP engine, and the steering was done via a tube going from the front fork to the steering wheel. Created by the ex-manager of the Jesman Company, Dean made bikes typical of the era. Sales weren't great. They survived by selling parts for more popular bikes. Started by making run-of-the-mill bikes with JAP engines, their gimmick being a spring suspension, and they ran with that until World War I forced them to halt production. Gamage was a large department store like Woolworths. If you don't know what Woolworths is, it was like a fancy Walmart. They made lightweight bikes using bought-in parts, engines, and frames for use as utilitarian transport. Their first bike was a 2-speed 211cc 2-stroke single. It was a conventional design and decently priced at 23 pounds. They made a lot of bicycles, millions in fact, but they also dabbled in making motorcycles. Their first attempt was with the usual conventional bike with bought-in parts and 5 different brands of engine. Made built-to-order bikes. The company was small, production was slow, survived because being small meant that any amount of sales was profitable. Made conventional midweight bikes and all-weather machines, which are bikes with anti-mud shields and big floorboards. My favorite company to hate on. Technically, this is just a branch of the Belgian company. There's nothing wrong with their engines. In fact, they're really good for the time. What bothers me is that it created a wave of lazy design where everyone thought they could clip a Minerva engine onto a bicycle frame and get rich. And naturally, they tried to make their own clip-on engine on a bicycle frame. I mean, why not? Everyone else is doing it. But then later, they went on to actually start making decent bikes for a few years before they switched to making cars. Stands for North London Garage. They made really cool-looking V-twins, including a 2,700cc monster. World War I shut down production, and they never came back. Made bikes that were known for their high quality and features that were rare for the time, like 3-speed gearboxes. These bikes sold well. It also helped that they won a number of competitions. Company that built frames to supply others. And then they thought to themselves, why not make our own with bought-in parts like everyone else? They puttered along, basically surviving off the sale of their frames. Then they spent a lot of money developing a 770cc V-twin right in time for World War I to start. Suppliers who made a bike with a Minerva engine and a primitive frame. This turned into making their own engines and bikes. Known for being high quality, they sold decently, but the accessory side of the business sold better, so they happily stopped production for World War I. Started by making autocycles, then quit, then came back to make primitive motorcycles that were known for being, quote, extremely simple. That's not a compliment, by the way. This is the real-life Acme, not the Looney Tunes factory, so it's not funny, unless you consider their bikes being unable to finish a single race funny. Acme started with the usual Minerva engine bikes, but they quickly switched to copies of more popular bikes like the Charter Leah. They basically started by making custom bikes, and they expanded their line, but by 1913 sales slowed, and they were down to one model, a 369cc 2-stroke single, before pausing for World War I. Started by making a halfway decent bike for the era, a pedal start 3-speed single. Although the engine was bought in, it was a JAP. Hazelwood was smart enough to know the market was oversaturated, so they focused on South Africa. Started with an experimental bike that used gears for its primary drive, and its muffler connected to the floorboards. After that didn't sell good, they paused for World War I. Made average lightweight bikes using bought-in engines, and they found a niche market selling to, quote, cautious riders who want easy control. Basically what would today be the big scooter crowd. You know how in the African savanna there are the second-tier predators that eat the scraps of the lions? That's basically Kleino. Kleino was always getting in on the tail end of stuff after everyone else cashed out. Known for making sidecars that could bank corners, they basically made bikes as an accessory to their sidecars. These were V-twins and flat twins between 680 and 708 cc's. SU is an abbreviation for Neckarslum and was a branch of the German company. They were known for tilting the engine 60 degrees and putting anti-skidding bands on the tires. This gave gave them a unique look, and they seem to have done well for a while. Bicycle company that made various singles between 293 cc's and 599 cc's. They focus on exporting mostly to Australia, where they sold about 100 a week. WDs, or Wart, Abbey, and Draper, were special in that they had a 496cc engine with a pressure lubrication system with a gear pump submerged in the oil sump at the bottom of the engine. That doesn't sound special, but this is the era when most bikes required you to hand pump oil. This meant the bike was expensive, which doomed it. They started with the Bicar, a bike with a bought-in Fafner engine and a frame running through the wheels and a hub center steering. They advertised it by claiming, quote, "No one who has ridden it will ever want to go back to the existing pattern of motor bicycles." This was false. So then they made a bike with a spring frame, which flopped, and then after that they stopped trying to be different and made conventional bikes. These did better, and that's what they did until World War I. Started with a primitive motor bicycle the press called serviceable. These didn't sell well, and New Hudson pulled out of the market in 1910. They came back with a couple average bikes with bought-in engines, but it wasn't until 1913 when they started making their own engines that they got a distinct identity for themselves and sales went up, except unfortunately World War I started. They started with a motor bicycle using a heavy-duty frame and 2 down tubes for more rigidity. From there they went on to make conventional bikes, which sold in the thousands, which was outstanding for pre-World War I. I hate to say it, but this company is middle of the road. They made average bikes with bought-in parts and then spammed as many models as possible in a blitz scaling attempt. They had singles, twins, ladies bikes, 2 and 4 strokes, sidecars, heavy, mid, and lightweights. Then World War I came and they got a contract with Russia, only for Russia not to pay them, leaving them on the verge of bankruptcy. Not to be confused with Excelsior USA, British Excelsior was the first to produce motorcycles in Britain, not counting one-offs and velocipedes. They started with the usual Minerva clip-on engines and Didion Bouton copies, but moved to more conventional bikes. Their bikes didn't sell good, so production halted. Started by making Pennington bikes and Didion trikes, and by 1902 they were a serious contender, to the point periodicals were boasting about how they were going to be the biggest motorcycle company in Britain, but the company decided to focus on cars instead, which in hindsight is a good move since they were successful at that. A few years later they returned and started making conventional lightweight singles and V-twins until World War I, where they made sidecars. Claimed to be Britain's oldest motorcycle company, even though they blatantly weren't. I guess in 1901 people had already forgotten about the late 1890s. Anyways, Quadrant started with a 211cc motorcycle for utility purposes. Then they designed their own engine, including a bike with 2 engines side by side, and then World War I made them pause. Made unique looking bikes. The tank looked like a bullet. The 345cc engine was horizontal and had a front and rear plunger springs. It was high tech for the time, but cost 185 pounds, almost a whole year's wage for an average person when World War I paused production. Imperial's first bike was front wheel driven with an engine between the handlebars. This flopped, so they made bicycles for the next 11 years. When they returned in 1912, they launched new Imperial, then had their first semi-hit with a 6 horsepower V-twin, and another in 1914 with a 300cc light tourist model in 1914. By World War I, they were showing a lot of potential for the future. Started by making primitive motor bicycles, but shifted to more conventional V-twins and singles. They sold a 210cc single for 25 pounds, which is about $3,500 today, and these sold well until World War I. It stands for Newcastle upon Tyne. They started by making competition bikes with 350cc engines. They entered some races and did okay, which raised sales, and soon they had a proper factory. Then World War I paused everything. Started as a Japanware manufacturer. They switched to bicycles and then motorcycles. Their first bikes were conventional using bought-in parts, but with some high-tech features for the time, like a chain case oil bath. During World War I, they made bikes for the French army. They made bikes between 225 and 350 cc's and a V-twin. They also entered races and did alright. They seemed to lack a clear vision, no push to aggressively win competitions, no marketing buzz, no attempts to find a niche. They kind of just carried on under their own inertia until World War I. Wolf started with clip-on engine bikes and 4 cars. Lucky for them, they shifted to making conventional motorcycles and changed the name from Wolf to Wolf Runa, then back to Wolf, and then World War I made them pause. Called Sun because the company made lamps at one point. They were another run-of-the-mill motorcycle company until they bought out Elvis two-stroke company and started making their own engines. Soon they were exporting to 7 different countries and being rebadged by 6 different companies until World War I. What a cool name, Matchless. But in the beginning, they were less than a match for others. They started by putting an engine behind the seat tube of a bicycle, which would overheat. Then they clipped on an engine that hanged from the down tube of a bicycle. Look at this passenger seat almost behind the rear wheel with no foot pegs. Terrible. After that flopped, they doubled down and clipped an even bigger engine on a bicycle. Then they made a 4-car, which also flopped. They should have died here, but they pulled themselves together. They made better bikes. They started winning a lot of races. This pushed up sales, and they reduced their line to a few bestsellers. World War I came. They made machine gun bikes for the military. Not a huge amount, but it was something. They were supremely okay at this time. Bikes were okay. Sales were okay. The name was kind of prophetic. Their lineup was a bunch of singles between 250 and 500 cc's that used 7 different brands of engine. This is basically what this is today. It cost 56 pounds back when the average yearly wage was 70. That would be like 48,000 pounds today relative to yearly income, but it sold okay. Laevis is Latin for lightweight, and indeed they specialize in lightweight 2-strokes. They even took on the slogan, "The master of two-strokes. First model 211cc single was named the Popular, and it was hugely popular, to the point they basically existed off sales of this bike until World War I. Scotland's leading bike company, and considered a major contender at one point. They started with the usual clip-on bicycle stuff, but soon they made their own frames and installed bought-in engines between 127 and 700 cc's. They were known for their high quality. All British engine company made airplane engines. They abbreviated their name to ABC instead of ABEC so they could be at the top of alphabetical list, except the joke's on them because Abbotsford got above them. One day ABC's chief engineer was asked by his friend to make improvements to his Douglas. That turned into making custom parts, which turned into designing their own engine, which turned into making a bike until World War I. The founder, James Kirby, was already in his 60s when he started the company. The bikes were between 350 and 771 cc's, with the 350 selling for about 19 pounds or about $2,200 adjusted for inflation, something even magazines of the time called unheard of. Sales were good, but World War I made them pause. They started out strong with a unique bike with a 4-stroke engine and apparently a perfect carburetor. Look at this. A horn, a mirror, a rear light. This is top notch. Compare that to this bike, which came out 2 years earlier. You see what I mean? Still, their board of directors couldn't get along and they forced out their founders. Then they focused on 3-speed V-twins until World War I. Car manufacturer who decided to make V-twin bikes. They were designed to be comfortable touring models with big mudguards, floorboards, big engines for the time, etc. They sold 100 a year until World War I. Harold Blackburn was a pilot who made money flying newspapers to rich people. He bought the rights to a motorcycle design for £5 from aviation pioneer Geoffrey de Havilland because he was short of money. Blackburn would become a millionaire thanks to this deal. The bike was a 500cc single and sold well until World War I. First they made a Didion copy like everyone else, then a bicycle with an engine clipped onto the down tube like everyone else. Eventually they started using higher end components and their own engines. They had some nice looking boxers and V-twins. They tried racing their own bike and failed. Then they tried to make a monocar, which also failed. Then the owner and his son had a falling out. Still, they were in a good position coming out of World War I. They made luxury inline 4 touring bikes that had high-end features for the Edwardian era, such as having 3-speed shaft drives, front and rear wheel suspension, etc. First they were called Touring Autocycle or TAC, then they changed it to Touring Motorcycles or TMC. They were basically the Electra Glide of their time, but they got bought out and World War I shut down production. Created from the ashes of Ormond, the Goodman family bought their equipment and created Veloce, which means fast in Latin. They went on to make various mid-sized bikes with their own engines, and when they decided to make some lightweight two-strokes, they branded them as Velocet, which would have future implications, constantly innovating their engines. Won competitive races, had a good design sense, and sold well. They had a pretty good start. In World War I, they produced war goods, made a bike after they made an engine, putting them above 90% of the rest. After that, they steadily innovated new designs, won races, and increased sales. In World War I, they made machine gun sidecars, the play-it-safe company that didn't take any risks, and it worked. They started by making small bikes with proprietary parts and focusing on making them as well built as possible. No aggressive marketing, no blitzscaling, just quality manufacturing. Although it didn't help that the few times they did try something different, it failed, like their passenger trailer that was, quote, most unpleasant, as exhaust and road dirt flew right into the passenger's face. Other than that, they were in a good position by World War I. The Stephen brothers started with a primitive American clip-on engine on a bicycle frame. Then they copied the engine and sold the design to other companies like Kleino. From there, they slowly expanded their line, developing new engines, entering competitions, and in World War I, they switched to making munitions and a few V-twin bikes for Russia. Name came from Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield. First bike had a clip-on Minerva engine in front of the handlebars. Terrible. They gave up on bikes for a few years to make cars, but then came back in 1909 with a V-twin and slowly expanded their line. In World War I, they made bikes for the military. Started as Felon and Rainer. Their distinguishing feature was having an engine at a 40-degree angle, acting as a structural support. Rainer died in a car accident, and Phelan partnered with Richard Moore, creating Phelan and Moore, or P&M. From there, they started producing various midweight models and entering endurance competitions in which they did well. In World War I, they made bikes for the Royal Flying Corps and the Armored Corps. They came out of the war in a good position. DOT stands for Devoid of Trouble or Damnable Offensive Transportation. It was founded by Harry Reid, a guy who liked to race motorcycles to win money until he realized it was more lucrative to sell bikes. That's big V-twins and decked out singles with the best bought-in parts and engines. 78 pounds for a 350 single, 4 times what the Deluxe sells for. These bikes were for racing, and DOT won a lot of competitions, meaning sales were great all the way to World War I. The company that proves having a good strategy makes all the difference. Like many on this list, they made conventional bikes with bought-in parts, but unlike them, they did it smart. First, they got a license to make proprietary engines so they could scale in-house. Then they entered competitions and did publicity stunts to get notoriety. And finally, they wholesaled their bikes to keep costs low. Needless to say, sales were great. And as they expanded their line, they used similar methods while aggressively switching engine brands and components to lower costs. When World War I came, they switched to making hand grenades, which got them a massive contract. You know those bands that come out of nowhere and have hit after hit? That's basically BSA. BSA stands for Birmingham Small Arms, and as the name suggests, they made weapons at one point. They started by releasing a bike that was, quote, easily distinguishable among rivals. Then Then BSA started selling out their entire production year after year after year. During World War I, BSA got a lucrative government contract to produce weapons founded by James Pa Norton, a toolmaker. They started producing bikes in 1902 with a 160cc engine clipped onto a bicycle frame. It's not a great start, but they quickly made better bikes. In 1907, they developed their own 633cc bike called the Big Four, but with the cost of development and failure to win competitions and poor marketing, the company went bankrupt in a few years. Norton's creditors stepped in and saved the company, and that's when the Dream Team came together. James Norton, the engineer, Bob Shelley, the experienced businessman, and Dan Wizard O'Donovan, a racer. From here on, Norton entered the big leagues. Shelley stabilized the finances, James Norton oversaw the creation of new engines and components, and O'Donovan went on to set a number of world records, like going 81 miles per hour in a 500cc bike. Sales boomed. World War I hardly affected them as they just sold bikes on a waiting list and making military bikes for Russia. King Dick is near the top because at the time they really had their act together. Every mistake they learned from quickly, and no victory caused them to rest on their laurels. When most firms thought of making things in their local town, King Dick was producing components on multiple continents. They started with a tricycle using a Minerva engine, but this didn't sell well. So they made a two-wheel version, which also didn't sell good, and normally the story ends here, but King Dick came back with improved versions and engines they made themselves. Finally, they had models that sold well, to the point that other companies licensed the right to produce these. By World War I, they were in a strong position when they switched to wartime production. Their first foray into motorcycling wasn't great. They started with an unimaginative GD-On clone, then committed the sin of clipping a Minerva engine onto the down tube of a bicycle, but they corrected these grievous errors. And in 1903, they made a better bike with their own 205cc engine. After that, sales increased, new models were launched, they bought the rights to make even better engines, and by World War I, they were in a solid position. Douglas started as a blacksmith shop, and long story short, they designed their own engine and frame. And in 2 years, it went from this to this. These were some nice looking bikes. Well, maybe not all of them. And people agreed. Whenever Douglas showed up to a motorcycle exhibit, they were usually the most popular venue, and they won races, lots of them. Sales were great. And when World War I came, they made tens of thousands of bikes for the military. By 1918, it seemed like Douglas might legitimately become Britain's largest bike maker. Triumph. What a great name. They were a bicycle company that dipped its toes into motorcycling to test the waters, and when they found the waters were warm, they dived in head first. They started by making small numbers of bicycles with clip-on Minerva engines. These sold 500 in 2 years. They opened a factory in Germany, they redesigned their bikes, and they sold thousands by 1910. In World War I, they got a contract to make 30,000 motorcycles, making them the #1 company on this list.